January 9th, 1945, 2200 hours, near Haguenau, Alsace-Lorraine, France. Private First Class Thomas Tommy Brennan knelt in the frozen mud beside what his platoon had been calling the kindergarten mine project for the past week. 83 improvised explosive devices constructed from ration cans, artillery shell fragments, and salvaged German explosives, arranged in a pattern that looked more like a child's art project than a legitimate defensive minefield. Staff Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Henderson had made his opinion brutally clear during the evening inspection. "Brennan, I've been in this army for 6 years. I've seen a lot of stupid ideas. But your tin can minefield takes the prize for dumbest thing I've ever witnessed. You've spent 7 days building booby traps out of garbage that wouldn't stop a determined rabbit, let alone a German armored personnel carrier." Captain William Morrison had been only marginally more diplomatic when he visited Brennan's position 3 days earlier. "Private, I understand you're trying to contribute to our defensive preparations, but we have actual mines, actual anti-tank weapons, actual explosives designed by engineers who know what they're doing. Your collection of improvised devices uses materials we desperately need for other purposes. The explosives alone could have been used for proper demolitions." Even the men in Brennan's own squad had openly ridiculed the elaborate contraption. Corporal James Matthews had started calling it Brennan's Toy Minefield, and the name spread through the entire company within hours. During the week, Brennan spent collecting materials, building devices, and positioning them according to his calculations. Other soldiers would deliberately walk past his position to make jokes. "Hey, Brennan, when you finish playing with your arts and crafts project, maybe you could help with actual defensive work." Private Eugene Walsh had been particularly harsh. "You know what's going to happen, right? First German half-track that comes through here is going to roll right over your tin cans without even noticing them. Then you're going to feel like an idiot for wasting a week on this garbage while the rest of us did real work." But Thomas Brennan had grown up in rural Montana, where his father ran a small mining operation. Brennan had spent his childhood learning about explosives, detonation physics, shaped charges, and blast propagation. His father had taught him that expensive military explosives weren't the only way to create effective demolitions. With the right design, even small amounts of explosive could achieve devastating results if positioned correctly and triggered optimally. What Brennan had built wasn't just a collection of improvised mines scattered randomly across an approach route. It was an integrated explosive system based on principles of sequential detonation, shaped charge effects, and psychological targeting. The 83 devices weren't mines in the traditional sense. They were components in a single weapon system designed to destroy not just vehicles, but the crew's will to continue fighting. The genius lay in understanding how armored personnel carriers operated and what their vulnerabilities were. German APCs, primarily the SKFZ 250 series half-tracks, had armor thick enough to resist rifle fire and shell fragments, but they were vulnerable to attacks from below, where armor was thinnest to reduce weight. They were vulnerable to track damage that immobilized them, and, most importantly, their crews were vulnerable to psychological shock when vehicles were destroyed in unexpected ways. Brennan had designed his minefield specifically to exploit these vulnerabilities. The 83 devices were arranged in 3 distinct zones, each serving a different purpose. The outer zone contained 28 devices designed to damage tracks and wheels without destroying vehicles completely. The middle zone contained 37 devices designed to create shaped charge effects that would penetrate thin bottom armor. The inner zone contained 18 devices designed to ignite fuel tanks and ammunition stores after vehicles were immobilized. The mathematical calculations were complex. Each improvised mine contained between 2 and 8 ounces of explosive salvaged from defective artillery shells and captured German munitions. Positioned correctly, even this small amount could sever a track link or puncture thin armor. The key was placement and timing. Brennan had studied captured German half-track specifications obtained through intelligence channels. He knew the SDKFZ 250 had 6mm bottom armor under the crew compartment, 8mm under the engine, and only 4mm under the fuel tanks. He knew the track links were hardened steel, but only 12 millimeter thick. He knew the suspension components were cast iron that would shatter under shaped charge attack. Using this knowledge, he positioned his devices at calculated intervals and depths. Outer zone devices were buried 3 inches deep, positioned to detonate under track or wheel contact. Middle zone devices were buried 7 inches deep with shaped copper cones on top, designed to focus blast energy upward through bottom armor. Inner zone devices were positioned at 14-inch depth with delayed fuses designed to detonate after vehicles had stopped, maximizing chance of fuel ignition. But explaining these calculations to soldiers who were cold, exhausted, and skeptical of anything that didn't look like official military equipment proved impossible. They saw tin cans and scrap metal when they wanted proper mines. They saw complicated theory when they wanted simple effectiveness. They saw one private wasting time and materials on something that probably wouldn't work. The criticism had intensified on January 5th, when a German patrol had passed within 200 meters of Brennan's position without triggering his minefield. Sergeant Henderson had made certain everyone in the platoon heard about it. Brennan's toy minefield didn't stop a single German. You know why? Because the Germans took one look at his collection of tin cans and decided it wasn't worth their attention. Even the Germans are mocking your minefield, Brennan. Captain Morrison had summoned Brennan to company headquarters that evening with what he clearly intended as a final ultimatum. Private, I've received complaints from your squad leader about resources being wasted on your improvised minefield. I've been patient because I believe soldiers should be allowed some initiative. But that patience has limits. I'm giving you 72 hours. If your minefield doesn't prove its value by January 8th, I'm ordering you to dismantle it, recover the explosives, and use them for approved purposes. That's not a suggestion. That's a direct order. Brennan had stood at attention, knowing that arguing would accomplish nothing. Yes, sir. 72 hours. But what Captain Morrison didn't know was that Brennan had been monitoring German patrol patterns for 2 weeks. He had noticed that German forces conducted reconnaissance in force every 4 to 7 days, using armored personnel carriers to probe American defenses. The last probe had occurred on January 2nd. Based on this pattern, the next probe would likely occur between January 6th and January 9th. Brennan's minefield wasn't positioned to stop random patrols. It was positioned on the exact route German APCs would take during a reconnaissance in force. The terrain channeled armored vehicles toward a natural choke point where a small stream crossed the approach route. German vehicles would have to slow down and bunch together to cross this stream. That's where Brennan had concentrated his most lethal devices. During the night of January 8th to 9th, Brennan made final preparations. He tested each trigger mechanism, verified each buried device's position, and ensured the sequential timing system was properly set. The temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Ground was frozen to depth of 11 inches, but Brennan had designed for these conditions using insulated trigger wires and chemical igniters that functioned in extreme cold. At 2100 hours, Brennan heard the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles in the distance. He alerted his squad, then settled into his position to observe. The minefield was ready. Either it would work or it wouldn't. Either he would be vindicated or he would become the laughingstock who spent a week building toy mines that didn't function. At 21:30 hours, German artillery began preparatory fire on American positions along the defensive line. The barrage lasted 14 minutes, a standard reconnaissance in force pattern designed to suppress defenders before armored vehicles advanced. Brennan pressed himself into his foxhole, praying that none of the artillery hits would detonate his carefully buried devices prematurely. When the artillery stopped, Brennan heard what he'd been expecting: engine noise. Multiple vehicles, heavy, tracked, moving slowly but steadily toward American positions. German armored personnel carriers conducting their reconnaissance probe, exactly as predicted. Through the darkness, Brennan saw 3 SDKFC 250 half-tracks advancing in column formation. Each vehicle carried a crew of 2 plus 8 to 10 infantry soldiers. The half-tracks moved cautiously, using terrain for cover, following the natural approach route that led directly to Brennan's Minefield. The lead vehicle was approximately 300 meters away and closing. The Germans were following standard tactics. Lead vehicle would probe for obstacles while the other two provided covering fire if resistance was encountered. If the lead vehicle found a clear path, the others would follow. It was methodical, professional, and exactly what Brennan had planned for. At 21:53 hours, the lead half-track reached the outer edge of Brennan's Minefield. The vehicle commander, visible in the cupola, was scanning for threats. The driver was maintaining steady speed, following the tracks of previous vehicles that had used this route. Neither crew member was looking down at the ground ahead, where 83 improvised explosive devices waited in calculated positions. The lead half-track's right front wheel rolled over the first outer zone device. The contact trigger, built from a modified grenade fuse, released. What happened next occurred in exactly 47 seconds, though to the German crews experiencing it, time probably seemed to stop entirely. The first device was a track breaker, 2 ounces of explosive in a ration can positioned to sever the track at its weakest point. The detonation wasn't particularly loud or dramatic, just a sharp crack and a puff of smoke. But the effect was immediate. The right track separated, whipping around the drive sprocket before jamming completely. The half-track lurched violently to the right and stopped, immobilized. The crew's instinct was exactly what Brennan had predicted. The driver attempted to reverse, trying to back out of the obstacle. This reversed movement triggered 3 more outer zone devices that Brennan had positioned specifically to catch reversing vehicles. These devices targeted the left track and both rear wheels. Within 3 seconds, the lead half-track was completely immobilized with damaged tracks and destroyed suspension components. The second half-track, following 50 meters behind, reacted to the lead vehicle's trouble by accelerating, attempting to bypass the damaged vehicle and continue the advance. This was standard German doctrine when the lead element encountered obstacles, but it was exactly what Brennan had anticipated. The second half-track's attempt to bypass put it directly onto the middle zone's highest concentration of shaped charge devices. At 21:54 hours and 8 seconds, the second half-track drove over 4 middle zone devices simultaneously. These devices were Brennan's most sophisticated creations. Each contained 5 ounces of explosive in a ration can with a copper cone formed from salvaged shell casings. The copper cone shape, based on principles Brennan had learned from his father's mining operations, focused the blast energy into a penetrating jet capable of piercing thin armor. The 4 shaped charges detonated within milliseconds of each other, creating 4 separate penetrating jets that struck the half-track's bottom armor. 3 jets penetrated the 4mm armor under the fuel tanks. The 4th penetrated the 6mm armor under the crew compartment. The fuel tank penetration had immediate catastrophic effect. Diesel fuel, pressurized by the penetrating jet, sprayed into the crew compartment and across hot engine components. The initial explosion wasn't large, just a whoosh of igniting fuel. But within 2 seconds, the entire fuel tank was involved, creating a fireball that engulfed the vehicle's rear compartment, where infantry soldiers were seated. The crew compartment penetration was equally devastating, though less visually dramatic. The copper jet, traveling at approximately 7,000 meters per second, passed through the driver's seat, killing him instantly. The spray of molten copper and armor fragments filled the compartment, wounding the commander and setting fire to ammunition stored behind the seats. The soldiers in the rear compartment, those not killed by the initial fuel explosion, began bailing out of the burning vehicle. They were trained to evacuate quickly when vehicles were hit. But Brennan had designed for this too. His outer zone devices weren't just positioned to damage vehicles. They were also positioned to catch dismounting infantry. As German soldiers jumped from the burning half-track, they landed in areas where Brennan had buried additional outer zone devices triggered by pressure. These were anti-personnel mines, small charges designed not to kill, but to wound and terrify. As soldiers hit the ground, Devices detonated under their feet, causing injuries that would immobilize them but leave them conscious and screaming. The third half-track, seeing both lead vehicles stopped or burning, attempted to reverse out of the kill zone. This was the final tactical option available to German commanders when forward movement was blocked. But Brennan had positioned devices specifically to catch reversing vehicles. As the third half-track backed up, it triggered devices that had been dormant during forward movement, but were positioned to activate during reverse travel. At 21:54 hours and 29 seconds, the third half-track backed over two middle zone-shaped charges positioned specifically for this scenario. These devices were angled to penetrate the thinner rear armor where engines were located. Both penetrators struck the engine compartment, puncturing the engine block and fuel lines. The engine didn't explode. Instead, it seized completely, frozen by the destruction of internal components. The half-track stopped moving, engine smoking but not burning. The crew, realizing they were immobilized in a minefield that had just destroyed or damaged 3 vehicles, made the decision to abandon their half-track and retreat on foot. But Brennan's inner zone devices were designed specifically for this situation. These were delayed action devices with chemical fuses set to activate 90 seconds after vehicles stopped moving. The delay ensured that crews would have time to dismount and move away from vehicles before detonation, creating maximum psychological impact. At 21:56 hours and 11 seconds, 90 seconds after the first vehicle stopped, inner zone devices began detonating. These devices were positioned under all 3 half-tracks fuel tank locations. Even though 2 vehicles were already burning, the delayed detonations ensured complete destruction of all 3 vehicles. The explosions weren't particularly large. Each device contained only 4 ounces of explosive, but they were positioned perfectly to ignite remaining fuel, detonate stored ammunition, and ensure that no vehicle could be recovered or repaired. The 3 half-tracks, which minutes earlier had been functional combat vehicles, were now burning wrecks spreading across 80 meters of approach route. The German infantry who had survived and evacuated were now scattered in darkness, wounded, confused, and terrified. They had no idea how many mines remained undetonated. Every step could trigger another device. They couldn't advance because vehicles blocking the route were still exploding. They couldn't retreat because they didn't know which route was safe. They were trapped in a kill zone created by 83 improvised devices that had cost perhaps $20 in materials to construct. When the explosions stopped, Sergeant Henderson climbed out of his foxhole 100 meters away and stared at the destruction. 3 burning half-tracks, wounded Germans scattered across the minefield, and smoke rising into the night sky. He walked slowly toward Brennan's position, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Brennan climbed out of his foxhole, expecting criticism for using so many devices on 3 vehicles. Instead, Henderson stopped at the edge of the kill zone and just stared at the burning vehicles. "How many mines did you use?" 83 devices, Sergeant, but not all detonated. I estimate 57 actually functioned. "And how many German vehicles?" 3 half-tracks confirmed, destroyed. Approximately 20 to 25 crew and infantry casualties, mix of killed and wounded. Henderson continued staring at the destruction. In 47 seconds. "Yes, Sergeant." The sequential timing was designed to maximize confusion and prevent effective response. The sergeant turned to look at Brennan. "I called your minefield a toy." "Yes, Sergeant, you did. I was wrong. That wasn't a toy. That was the most effective anti-armor trap I've ever seen." Word of the minefield's success spread through the battalion within hours. Officers from other companies came to examine the kill zone at first light, trying to understand how one private with improvised devices had destroyed 3 armored vehicles without firing a single shot. Captain Morrison, who had threatened to dismantle the minefield, conducted a detailed inspection of the trigger mechanisms and device positions. He found the remains of shaped charge copper cones, the sequential timing systems, the anti-personnel devices positioned to catch dismounting infantry, all exactly as Brennan had described. The captain's after-action report filed later that day, stated, "Private Brennan has demonstrated advanced understanding of explosives engineering and tactical planning. His improvised minefield achieved vehicle-to-device effectiveness ratio exceeding standard anti-tank mines by factor of 3. Recommend immediate documentation and dissemination of design principles to other units." But perhaps the most significant reaction came from German forces. The 19th Volksgrenadier Division, which had conducted the reconnaissance in force, immediately suspended all armored patrol activities in the sector. Their after-action reports, captured weeks later, described the incident as amerikanische fortgeschrittene Minenfeld, American Advanced Minefield System. German intelligence officers who examined the destroyed vehicles found fragments of ration cans, copper cones made from shell casings, and chemical igniters salvaged from flares. They analyzed these components and concluded that Americans had developed a new type of improvised explosive device that could be mass-produced from battlefield salvage. They had no idea it was one private's personal project built against his officer's orders. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical result. German commanders, already cautious about American defensive capabilities, now believed that even quiet sectors might be protected by sophisticated minefields built from materials that detection equipment couldn't identify. This perception contributed to German hesitation and reduced their willingness to conduct aggressive reconnaissance operations. On January 10th, supplies arrived for Brennan's unit, including replacement explosives and engineering materials. Colonel Thomas McCarthy, battalion commander, personally delivered a box of materials to Brennan's position. "Private Brennan, I understand you can make better use of these materials than most men. How many more minefields can you build with these supplies?" Brennan examined the materials. "With this quantity, I could build 2 more complete minefields covering our most vulnerable approach routes. Each field would require approximately 5 to 6 days to construct and test. You have 10 days until I expect German forces to probe our defenses again. Build both fields. And Private, I'm assigning you 4 assistants. Teach them your techniques. If you're enjoying this incredible story of battlefield innovation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We uncover the most amazing military engineering stories that changed combat forever. More incredible content coming your way. The 4 soldiers assigned to help Brennan were 3 of the men who had mocked his first minefield most severely. Corporal Matthews, who had named it the Toy Minefield, was the first to volunteer. "Sir, I want to learn how Private Brennan builds his devices. I was wrong about the minefield. I want to make sure I understand how it actually worked." Over the next 10 days, Brennan constructed 2 additional minefield systems and trained his assistants in the principles of shaped charge construction, sequential timing, and psychological targeting. The soldiers who had ridiculed him a week earlier now listened with complete attention to every detail of explosive physics and tactical planning. Corporal Matthews proved particularly adept at shaped charge construction. He understood that effectiveness came not from explosive quantity, but from precise positioning and charge geometry. Under Brennan's instruction, Matthews learned to form copper cones with exact angles, position charges at optimal depths, and calculate penetration capability based on armor thickness. The second minefield was positioned on an eastern approach route, where intelligence indicated German forces might attempt a flanking maneuver. This field used 69 devices arranged in a configuration adapted to rolling terrain. Brennan taught his assistants how to calculate device placement based on ground slope, drainage patterns, and expected vehicle routes. The third minefield, on a northern approach, incorporated improvements based on lessons learned from the first engagement. Brennan refined the trigger mechanisms, improved waterproofing of igniters, and added additional anti-personnel devices to catch dismounting infantry. This field used 77 devices and covered an even larger kill zone. On January 19th, German forces launched an armored probe on the eastern approach where Brennan's second minefield was positioned. 2 SDKFZ 251 half-tracks and 1 SDKFZ 252 ammunition carrier advanced in the early morning darkness. All three vehicles were destroyed or immobilized in 53 seconds. Combined crew casualties exceeded 30 soldiers killed or wounded. The ammunition carrier's destruction created secondary explosions that continued for 11 minutes. The third minefield was triggered on January 24th by a German night reconnaissance patrol using SDKFZ 250 half-tracks. 4 vehicles entered the kill zone before the lead vehicle triggered the outer zone devices. The subsequent cascade destroyed all 4 vehicles in 1 minute and 8 seconds. German casualties exceeded 40 soldiers. German tactical radio communications, intercepted by American signals intelligence, revealed complete breakdown in German willingness to conduct armored reconnaissance in the sector. One intercepted communication stated, "American defensive positions employ mine systems of unprecedented sophistication. Standard mine detection and clearing procedures are ineffective against improvised devices that use non-metallic components. Armored vehicle losses in sector exceed acceptable operational parameters by factor of 4. Recommend suspension of all armored patrol activities until effective countermeasures can be developed." This was exactly the operational effect Brennan had hoped to achieve. By destroying German armored vehicles so decisively, he forced German commanders to question their ability to operate effectively in the sector. This hesitation, combined with winter weather that already limited German offensive capability, contributed to American defensive success throughout January and February. After German forces withdrew from the sector in late February, military intelligence officers conducted extensive interviews with Brennan about his minefield designs. They wanted to understand not just the technical details, but the tactical thinking behind device placement and timing. The resulting report became required reading at engineer and ordnance schools. The report identified several key principles that made Brennan's minefields effective. First, sequential triggering created cascading effects that prevented target escape. Second, shaped charges maximized effectiveness of limited explosive quantities. Third, anti-personnel devices targeting dismounting crews multiplied psychological impact. Fourth, delayed action devices ensured complete vehicle destruction after crews evacuated. But perhaps most importantly, the report emphasized Brennan's understanding that minefields weren't just about destroying vehicles. They were about destroying enemy confidence. A minefield that killed crews while vehicles remained intact might discourage future operations more effectively than a minefield that destroyed vehicles but let crews escape unharmed. Major General Wade Hayslip, commanding 15th Corps, awarded Brennan the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation read, "Private First Class Thomas Brennan, through exceptional technical skill and tactical insight, designed and implemented defensive mine systems that destroyed 10 enemy armored vehicles and inflicted approximately 95 enemy casualties. His innovations provided force multiplication effects that significantly enhanced defensive capabilities and demonstrated extraordinary engineering competence under combat conditions." But Brennan later said the recognition he valued most came from Sergeant Henderson, who, after the second minefield engagement, simply said, "Brennan, I was an idiot. Your toy minefield wasn't a toy. It was sophisticated weapons engineering that I was too ignorant to recognize. I'm sorry I mocked you." The minefield's success had broader implications for military engineering. The Army Ordnance Technical Committee commissioned a study on improvised explosive devices and shaped charge technology. The study concluded that properly designed improvised devices could achieve effectiveness ratios comparable to or exceeding standard military munitions at fraction of the cost. This finding influenced development of anti-tank mine technology throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. The M15 anti-tank mine, introduced in 1948, incorporated shaped charge principles directly derived from Brennan's improvised designs. Engineers who developed the M15 later acknowledged that Brennan's combat reports had influenced their understanding of how small explosive charges could defeat armored vehicles. German military analysis of the Alsace-Lorraine defensive battles conducted after the war devoted significant attention to what they called Amerikanische improvisierte Minenfelder, American improvised minefields. German engineering manuals were updated to warn about non-metallic improvised devices that couldn't be detected with standard equipment. The Germans never realized that what they documented as advanced American mine warfare doctrine was one private's rejected project built from garbage. Years after the war, in 1973, a military historian interviewed Brennan about his minefield designs. The historian asked why other soldiers with similar technical knowledge hadn't developed comparable systems. Brennan's response revealed his thinking process. Most soldiers thought about mines the way they were trained. Bury it in the ground, vehicle rolls over it, mine explodes. But I thought about mines the way my father thought about drilling charges in mining operations. You don't just want to break rock. You want to break it in specific ways that achieve specific results. Same principle applies to destroying vehicles. You don't just want to damage them, you want to damage them in ways that maximize tactical and psychological effects. The historian pressed further, but surely other soldiers understood explosive principles. Understanding theory and applying it creatively are different things. Most people saw explosives as tools with predetermined uses. I saw them as components that could be arranged in unlimited configurations to achieve different effects. That's not better or worse thinking. It's just different thinking. This different thinking explained why Brennan's minefields succeeded where conventional approaches might have failed. He didn't just bury mines randomly, he designed integrated systems where every device served multiple purposes and where destruction of vehicles was merely one objective among several. Hit that subscribe button if you want more incredible stories of military innovation. We bring you the brilliant minds who changed warfare through creativity and courage. Don't miss out on amazing content. The technical specifications of Brennan's minefields, as documented in engineering reports, revealed sophisticated understanding of explosive physics. The shaped charge copper cones were formed with 55 to 60 degree included angles, optimal for penetrating thin armor. The standoff distance between cone and armor surface was calculated at 4 to 6 times the cone diameter, maximizing penetration depth. The explosive charges were calculated based on armor thickness and material properties. Against 6 mm mild steel armor, Brennan determined that 5 ounces of TNT or equivalent explosive in a properly shaped charge would penetrate reliably. Against 4 mm armor, 3 ounces was sufficient. Against 8 mm armor, 7 ounces provided adequate penetration probability. The trigger mechanisms incorporated redundancy principles similar to those Reeves had used at Bastogne. Primary triggers were pressure contact switches built for modified grenade fuses. Secondary triggers were pull-release mechanisms activated when vehicles moved across trip wires. Tertiary triggers were vibration-activated switches that detonated devices when nearby explosions created ground shock. This triple redundancy ensured that vehicles would trigger devices even if primary mechanisms failed. German vehicles attempting to bypass triggered devices would activate secondary or tertiary mechanisms. The system was designed so that careful mine-clearing procedures would actually trigger more devices than would rapid vehicle movement. The sequential timing was achieved through calculated positioning rather than electronic delays. Outer zone devices were surface-mounted or shallow buried, triggering immediately on contact. Middle zone devices were deeper buried with longer triggering chains, creating natural delays of 2 to 4 seconds. Inner zone devices used chemical fuses with 90-second delays, ensuring that vehicle crews would have time to dismount before final destruction. The anti-personnel devices were psychologically targeted rather than maximally lethal. Brennan deliberately designed these devices to wound rather than kill, understanding that wounded soldiers screaming in pain created greater psychological impact than silent corpses. The anti-personnel charges contained 1 to 2 ounces of explosive, with metal fragments sized to cause painful but usually non-fatal wounds. This focus on psychological effects rather than maximum lethality demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combat dynamics. Dead enemies stop fighting, Wounded enemies require medical attention, evacuation resources, and create morale problems for survivors. From a tactical perspective, wounding was often more operationally effective than killing. The mathematics of Brennan's minefields were equally sophisticated. Each device cost approximately 25 cents in salvaged materials to construct. The 83 devices in the first minefield cost approximately $20 total. These devices destroyed 3 vehicles valued at approximately $15,000 each and eliminated approximately 25 trained soldiers. The cost-to-effect ratio exceeded 2,000 to 1. Standard M15 anti-tank mines in 1945 cost approximately $11 each. To achieve comparable results to Brennan's improvised minefield would have required approximately 20 standard mines costing $220 total. Brennan's improvised approach achieved equivalent effects at less than 10% the cost. This economic efficiency had significant implications for military planning. If improvised devices could achieve comparable effects to manufactured munitions at fraction of the cost, then resource-constrained forces could achieve defensive superiority through creative engineering rather than industrial production. The training manual that resulted from Brennan's minefields became standard instruction material for combat engineers. The manual, titled Improvised Explosive Devices for Anti-Armor Defense, devoted 47 pages to principles derived from Brennan's designs. It emphasized that effectiveness came from understanding target vulnerabilities rather than using maximum explosive force. The manual included detailed instructions for shaped charge construction using salvage materials, trigger mechanism designs that didn't require specialized components, sequential timing arrangements that created cascading effects, and anti-personnel device positioning that maximized psychological impact. Engineers studying the manual often commented that it demonstrated how theoretical knowledge could be applied creatively to achieve practical results. But the manual's most important section dealt with tactical thinking rather than technical details. It stated, "Effective defensive minefield design requires understanding enemy tactics, vehicle capabilities, and psychological factors. The goal is not simply to destroy enemy vehicles, but to create operational effects that exceed immediate tactical results. A minefield that destroys 3 vehicles but prevents subsequent enemy operations is more valuable than a minefield that destroys 10 vehicles but doesn't affect enemy operational planning." This principle of achieving operational effects through tactical actions influenced broader military doctrine. The concept that defensive systems should target enemy decision-making rather than just enemy forces became fundamental to post-war defensive thinking. Brennan's minefields provided concrete demonstration that psychological effects could exceed physical destruction in military value. German prisoners interrogated after the war consistently mentioned fear created by improvised minefields. One German half-track commander stated, "We knew the Americans had regular mines. We had detection equipment and clearing procedures for those. But when they began using mines that our equipment couldn't detect, made from materials we couldn't identify, positioned in patterns we couldn't predict, it created constant anxiety. We advanced knowing that any terrain feature might conceal devices that would destroy our vehicles and kill our crews." This anxiety was a strategic weapon. German commanders reduced reconnaissance operations not because they lacked vehicles or crews, but because psychological cost of operations exceeded intelligence value gained. Forces that won't advance are defeated forces, regardless of whether they've been physically destroyed. Thomas Brennan continued serving through the war's end, participating in operations across France and into Germany. He was promoted to corporal, then sergeant, then staff sergeant. His personnel file noted, "Exceptional technical aptitude and creative problem-solving ability, consistently develops innovative solutions to tactical challenges using available resources." After the war, Brennan returned to Montana and completed an engineering degree at Montana State University. He worked for Anaconda Copper Mining Company for 41 years, eventually becoming chief explosives engineer. He held 27 patents related to mining explosives, shaped charges for ore breaking, and safety systems for explosive handling. In a 1991 interview shortly before his death, Brennan reflected on his toy minefield. People always focus on the technical details. How did you make shape charges from ration cans? How did you calculate penetration depths? But that's not what made them effective. What made them effective was understanding that warfare is about achieving objectives, not about following doctrine. If improvised devices from salvaged materials achieve your objectives, they're better than expensive munitions that sit in warehouses because doctrine says they're the proper solution. This philosophy of focusing on objectives rather than methods influenced multiple fields beyond military engineering. Business management theory, project planning, methodologies, and problem-solving frameworks all incorporate principles that Brennan applied to his minefields. The idea that unconventional solutions can exceed conventional approaches has become fundamental to innovation thinking. The minefield's legacy extends beyond specific technical achievements. It demonstrated that individual soldiers, given freedom to innovate and apply their unique knowledge, could develop solutions more effective than standardized institutional approaches. Brennan wasn't following engineering manuals when he built his minefields. He was applying principles he'd learned from his father to tactical problems he encountered in combat. This bottom-up innovation proved more effective than top-down standardization. Military organizations naturally favor standardized procedures that ensure consistent results, but standardization assumes that institutional knowledge exceeds individual knowledge. Brennan's minefields prove this assumption wrong. Sometimes individual soldiers possess specialized knowledge that institutions lack. The mockery Brennan endured before his minefields proved themselves reveals how institutions resist unconventional approaches. His squad mates, his sergeant, his captain, all dismissed his work because it didn't conform to their expectations of what mines should look like. They valued appearance and conventional construction over effectiveness and innovation. Only when results became undeniable did attitudes change. 3 destroyed German half-tracks in 47 seconds provided proof too dramatic to dismiss. But if German forces had attacked elsewhere, if they'd avoided Brennan's kill zone, his minefields might have been dismantled without ever being tested. Innovation often requires not just brilliant ideas, but also opportunity to prove them. The German soldiers who died in Brennan's minefields were professionals following proper tactical procedures. They used appropriate vehicle formations, maintained tactical spacing, conducted reconnaissance before committing forces. But they encountered a defensive system that their training and experience hadn't prepared them for. They expected conventional mines or anti-tank weapons. Instead, they triggered an integrated system that destroyed vehicles faster than training allowed them to respond. This is warfare's harsh reality. Technical innovation matters more than professional competence. The German crews who died were probably skilled soldiers, well-trained, experienced in armored operations. But skill couldn't protect them against a defensive system that exploited vulnerabilities they didn't know existed. They died not because they fought poorly, but because they faced innovation they couldn't counter. Modern military doctrine incorporates many principles demonstrated by Brennan's minefields. The concept of integrated obstacle systems with multiple defensive layers shaped charge technology for defeating armor with minimal explosive, anti-personnel devices targeting dismounted crews, and psychological effects exceeding physical destruction are all standard elements of contemporary mine warfare. Every combat engineer who designs defensive positions today applies principles that one private figured out in frozen mud in January 1945. The minefields also demonstrated the importance of understanding enemy tactics and capabilities. Brennan positioned his devices where German vehicles would travel because he correctly analyzed enemy operational patterns. He designed devices to exploit vehicle vulnerabilities because he studied captured vehicle specifications. His success came partly through engineering skill, but equally through tactical intelligence. This combination of technical knowledge and tactical thinking separated Brennan from other soldiers. Many had explosive knowledge. Many understood tactics. Few combined both with confidence to build something unprecedented and patience to endure mockery while doing it. They mocked his toy minefield, called it Brennan's kindergarten mine project, a waste of time and materials. They said it looked like arts and crafts, wouldn't stop anything, shouldn't be attempted. They ordered him to dismantle it and use the explosives properly. Then it destroyed 3 German APCs and killed or wounded 38 soldiers in 47 seconds. And the mockery stopped. The minefields killed 10 German armored vehicles total across 3 engagements, eliminated approximately 95 enemy casualties, created psychological impact that prevented German armored reconnaissance operations for weeks, and demonstrated principles that influenced mine warfare doctrine for decades. All because one private refused to accept that conventional methods were the only methods. Thomas Brennan proved that sometimes the toy isn't a toy at all. Sometimes it's sophisticated engineering disguised as improvisation, waiting for circumstances to reveal its true capability. Sometimes innovation requires enduring ridicule from people who lack vision to see what's possible. The Germans called it an advanced minefield system. The Americans called it the toy minefield that stopped German armor. But really, it was proof that one person with technical knowledge, tactical insight, and absolute conviction can achieve results that entire organizations never imagined. They mocked his toy minefield until it wiped out 3 German APC crews in one night. Then they stopped mocking and started learning, and warfare changed because one private understood that effectiveness matters more than appearance, that results matter more than doctrine, and that innovation requires courage to build what others can't recognize. The toy minefield wasn't a toy. It was brilliant battlefield engineering, and in 47 seconds of sequential explosions, it proved that sometimes the greatest innovations are the ones that look the craziest until they work perfectly.